Victor, you were just telling me about your attendance at the Nobel Prize of 1997. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, we were talking about Stockholm, and I had one of my best short city visits to Stockholm in 1997. My wife and I went there to celebrate with two of my partners that were getting the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for that
Wow.
year, Bob Merton and Myron Scholes. And they didn't have tickets for all of us to go to the ceremony, but we were there for dinners and just hanging out. And yeah, I just loved Stockholm so much. I had been there before for business, but not just for fun. And being there with my wife was great. We had so much delicious herring of all kinds. And then when I went back to London, I was trying to keep my herring consumption up, but I couldn't find any good herring. And a Swedish friend of mine explained it to me that the Swedes keep the really good herring for the local consumption. I also went for one of my best city runs of all time. I mean, it was just absolutely gorgeous going for like a 5-mile run around Stockholm. So yeah, I always wanted to get back, which I haven't done. I've done some traveling around the Norwegian coast, but yeah, I'd love to get back to Stockholm. And anyway, great memories of it.
Yeah, that's glorious. I mean, maybe you could get Nikolai Tangen to invite you to an NBIM conference since you're doing a lot of these public lectures now. That'd be a great excuse to be brought over back to Scandinavia.
Yeah, I should send him a few copies of our book.
And what was it the prize was for, your two colleagues?
Primarily, it was for the options for the options pricing formula. The Black-Scholes, Fisher-Black had passed away by then, but some people call it the Black-Scholes-Merton model. Although the main paper that came out was the Fisher-Black-Myron-Scholes paper. But yeah, so they primarily won it for the option pricing formula or discovery or framework. But it was much broader than that, and both of them were very, very productive researchers and academics. Yeah, we'll talk more about Bob in particular, I'm sure, on the podcast.
And so they have phenomenal mathematical chops.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Bob was one of these people that they referred to as the rocket scientist because he was out at Caltech and he was studying like the mathematics of controlling missiles and projectiles. And those mathematics of control were what he brought to finance, and he and others. But there really was this connection to rocket science in the early days of finance. Over time, like everything that they figured out using kind of rocket science math was turned out to be much simpler than that, and that you could have shown and proven the same things in much easier ways. But to begin with, they brought some really heavy-duty math into these finance problems. Finance is so much simpler than that, but that was what they, in the beginning, that's what they had to do. And when you go back and look at those papers, it's just incredible what they, the machinery that they brought to it.
It's unbelievable, eh? Maybe they were sort of foundational for the technology we have now with the Iron Dome in Israel, where you can intercept a missile.
Well, they didn't make real contributions to the math. They learned the math, and then they came into finance where everything was easier. Okay. So I mean, they're brilliant, but I wouldn't say that they made big contributions. I mean, for almost very, very few of the people that made big contributions to finance made any contributions to math.
So then, for these two meant to be your colleagues, assumes you also have extraordinary mathematical chops. Is this really your core skill that you've brought to your various career postings over the years?
Oh no! I mean, no, I don't have those, super strong mathematical skills. I have decent intuition, and I think that what I've excelled at over time is taking complicated ideas and making them more accessible to a broader range of people, whether that was within investment banking, hedge funds, and then more recently, within wealth management and just financial literacy in general. So I mean, I can understand the music of I can appreciate the music of the math, but I am not a composer.
So a communicator.
Yes, I think so. I think that would be a fair representation of my skills. Yeah.
No, not to belittle it all. But without the communication, you don't have anything, right?
Yeah, no, it's good. And I mean, I wouldn't claim that I've really invented very much. It's just all taking working in collaboration with others and taking what others have done and saying that makes a lot of sense. Why are people not thinking about things as much that way? And it's because it's so abstract or so complicated. Let's find ways of making these ideas more resonant with people.
Was that also core to the work you were doing at Solomon back in the beginning of your career?
I think it was, yeah. I think that there the audience was the management of Salomon Brothers. So in order for us to be able to do the trading that we were doing, we needed to make management comfortable that what we were doing made sense. And so, there were no black boxes. It was like, okay, this is why we're doing this or that, and how we're thinking about how to size it and so on. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what we did at Solomon was, making the firm comfortable in committing capital to the anomalies that we were seeing at the time. And of course, the management was extremely receptive and open-minded and had a risk-taking character to it.
Did you work alongside Bill Browder at Solomon?
I met him a few times back in Solomon days, and then I met him much later on in London again. And actually, if we have time for a funny story a little bit.
Of course we do, yeah.
So I was with a friend of mine. We ran a book club in London for many years where the only thing was that any book that we were going to talk about over dinner, we had to make sure that the author would be willing to come. So we would invite authors, and we had some great authors over the years, amazing dinners and talking to these authors about their books. And so the idea came up to invite Bill Browder to talk about Red Notice. And actually the place that we used to do these dinners mostly was on Kensington, on Kensington Church Street up at the top, this Kensington Place fish restaurant. And we had this room in the back that had a big window that was open to the street, right? So anyway, we were going about doing this, and then I went over to Bill's office in Mayfair and talked to him about it and so on. And when I was looking at him, I was like, we look a little bit like each other. And then I was like, and then I thought about it some more, and I was like, geez, I don't want to have Bill for dinner with a whole bunch of us with a big picture window and some guy. So anyway, I won't say more than that. But we wound up, not going forward with him as a guest out of fear. Out of being chickens ourselves, but anyway, he's a cool guy.
Oh, that's a shame. I mean, if you ever revitalize that book club, I'm sure Bill would be a very, very happy and willing guest.
Yeah, no, he's much safer like this.
I mean, so you must have a pretty deep interest in broader literature then, if you're hosting a book club yourself, not exclusively finance books. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes. Well, actually, yes, definitely. And in my life, until I was around 40, I just hadn't read very, very broadly. I was like this very narrow reader. I'd been, had a fun childhood that didn't involve too much books. And then I was working and didn't involve too much books. But then I took a sabbatical from the age of about 40 to 50. And one of the big things that I wanted to do in those years was to really catch up on, my basic, reading and familiarity with some of the great works. So, I still, just given that I got such a late start, I would not say that I'm very literary, but I've made an effort to catch up, and I thank Audible and everybody that's been involved in audiobooks for making that happen, because in the last, 10 or 15 years, probably 90% of the books I've read, or 80%, have been while walking my dog or doing long drives and things like that.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, it's great.
Give us a sense for some of the other authors that you managed to coerce into a dinner.
Oh, wow. Well, let's see. Our first one was the author of Legionnaire, Simon. What was his name? He's this English guy that when he was very young went off and joined the French Foreign Legion, and it's a terrific book. I mean, it's so exciting. It's so strange in a way, that he would do this, and he wound up in Algeria, and it was gruesome. And then, his life went on from there, and he wound up being like the president or something, or the CEO maybe of Hutchison Whampoa. Really a cool guy, Simon.
Is he still alive?
I think he is. Yeah. He's very fit. He's probably around 80 or so. Great guy. That was one of our first.
Make for an
we
amazing
had
podcast
William
guest.
McCaskill come in early on, on effect, in the early days of effective altruism. But I think maybe our second author that we had was Rory Stewart, and Rory at that time was like teaching maybe at Yale or Harvard. He wasn't into politics at all. Or maybe he had I guess he had just come back from that governorship that he had in southern Iraq. But he had written the book about walking all across the Near and Middle East. Phenomenal guy. And then we all became really friendly with him. A couple of the members of the book club wound up working on his staff, actually, when he was in Parliament and so on, and in the cabinet. So Rory was another good one. We had Matt Ridley came in. He was great. We had so many really, really good ones over the years. It was a great book club, and then COVID put a stop to it, and now we're getting started again. Although I'm not in London, but my friend Alan Shafran is running it now. And actually, the restart of our book club in London, Alan invited me to be the guest author. And so we got the book club restarted a few months ago when I was visiting London. And very kindly, I was both a member and also the guest author, which was really fun.
Do you have to be a high net worth individual to qualify for access to this book club?
No, not at all. Just be just in the circle of friends somehow. So it's not super diverse, but it's got a bit of diversity, and we tend to invite the authors back as well if they want to come and join. So every once in a while, an author has come, a previous author has come back to the book club.
The value of that network, presumably, would be just immense, essentially. And I'm not talking about a financial value, just the value of knowing people that are in either doing interesting things or in interesting places. Do you ever consider the value of your own network over the course of your entire career, having, as we started with, guests with Nobel Prize winners to now this big book club and many other things in between? Trying to make a broader point on just how important the network is that you accrue over a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, my goodness, my friends, colleagues, people I've met have enriched my life so much. I mean, I can't imagine, what my life would be devoid of those relationships. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, in some ways, everything that I am is a result of all of these friendships, relationships, mentoring, and even chance. Random acts of generosity along the way that I can think of. I mean, it's been, I'm sure, so many of our lives are like that.
I teed you up about questions on serendipity earlier, so bear that in mind as we get further down. But the type of serendipity that can come from your network, is truly life-altering at times.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So you took this epic 10-year sabbatical. I would love to understand more why you decided to do that, because presumably that decade in your 40s and 50s can be some of the most valuable years to either accrue wealth or just really double down on all the good work you've done in the decades before. but by stepping away, it seems there was quite a large opportunity cost there. So I'd just love to understand more your decision behind deciding to take 10 years off versus just going into something else.
So first of all, what happened was, so I was a partner of LTCM. LTCM failed. I stayed around for a while to liquidate to wind down LTCM on behalf of this 14-bank consortium, and then to help my partners get started with a new venture. So it was around 2000, a couple years after the collapse of LTCM, and our office was in Conduit Street. I lived in Kensington, and I rode my bike back and forth to work most days. Like that was what I would do. So one day, I'm leaving work, and it's around 6:30 or so, something like that. And I take my bicycle and I go to the lift and I press the button. We were on the second floor, I think. I press the button. I see the lift is up. Both lifts are up on the 7th floor. And I just immediately was like, oh my God, I don't want to wait for that. So I opened up the stairwell door, took my bicycle, and ran down the stairs. And as I'm running down the stairs with my bicycle on my shoulder, I was thinking, gosh, I could fall and really hurt myself here. What am I doing? Why am I so impatient to get down that I can't wait for the elevator? And it just, all of a sudden, it just occurred to me that the reason I'm rushing is because I want to be home. I want to be home with my kids. I have and had 3 kids at that point, and a loving wife, and I wanted to be home. And I was like, well, if I want to be home, why am I here? And all of a sudden, it was like a light went off that, yeah, I like my work, but I really love my family and want to spend more time with my family. And I'm racing to almost breaking my neck to leave the office and ride my bike home. And so that at that moment, I was like, okay, I'm going to stop working. So once I decided to stop working, then this idea of the long-term sabbatical came, and realizing that I was whatever I would do in the future, I was going to be a businessman. That I don't think that business acumen decays that much as we get older. I think that a 50-year-old businessman can be, as good as a 40-year-old, as a 60-year-old. It's not like being a musician or lots, there are lots of things where I think that, your productivity does go down. And sure, I was going to give up something then, but I didn't think I was giving up that much. And I said, okay, I'm going to take a 10-year break until my 2 younger kids are at university, and then I'll start working again. And I filled those 10 years with it was just it was wonderful. It was a wonderful 10 years of doing so many of the things that I dreamt about doing. Particularly spending a lot of time with my kids, which was really great. But yeah, it was terrific.
So up until this point, you presumably worked insane hours, hugely ambitious, surrounded by a lot of ambitious people as well. I just would like to understand more. It gets maybe 6 months into this sabbatical. You're reading all the books you want. You're spending loads of time with your kids. But, surely there hits a Wednesday. There's nothing on the calendar. And you start thinking, okay, let's start doing something again. The fact that extended for 10 years, I just find particularly interesting. Not exactly sure why, but just do.
Yeah. Well, so in the beginning, it's just intense excitement for the first few years, and by the end of the 10 years, that bucket list, you've checked off a bunch of different things, and it is decaying like that. So by as I got into the second half of it, the excitement of like, oh my goodness, I'm not working, I can do anything, and I'm doing anything and everything. So in the beginning, it's just it's wonderful, in those first few years. And in addition to being with the kids all the time, I learned how to fly.
Nice.
And I did a lot of flying of small planes and got my instrument rating and all that. I did a lot of climbing, hiking, skiing, a lot of outdoors things, a lot of physical things. And I did a lot of learning. I picked up a bunch of languages, which now have sort of drifted away from me. But yeah, it was just so much fun in that beginning part. And I think the 10 years, I sort of had this idea of 10 years The kids going off to university. Our youngest was still, was still at home when I started working again. But yeah, it was great, and I just got into that mode. And there's just never enough time, in our lives. So I never felt, I've got to fill up time. There was just never enough time for what I wanted to do. The days. Yeah, there's just so little time.
Oh, it's incredible. Was there a sense as well of, say, burnout or trauma that really put you off business for a while because of the end of LTCM?
Well, there were two kinds of burnout, I would say. The first was that I was like, okay, I don't want to do this hedge fund thing anymore. I want to move, or I don't want to do proprietary trading. I don't want to be spending my time trying to beat the market, whether it's working at a bank or working at a hedge fund. So I made that decision that I had had enough of it, and I'd been doing it for long enough where I felt that I wasn't learning, so much anymore, that it wasn't, that I was on a flatter part of the learning curve. So that I realized at the time, but I never thought of myself as being stressed at work. Which I think is really, really typical of a this is a really typical thing. It's not just me. I didn't think I was stressed. I didn't think that I was that I was under pressure. But when the pressure was relieved, I noticed it. It was like, wait a second, everything about me feels better. I don't feel tired anymore. My body just responded like, I just had this feeling of well-being in every aspect of health, and I realized that that I was under a lot of stress, that I didn't know it at the time, but when it was relieved, then I could really tell. And I think a lot of people are like that we don't feel that that we're just comfortable with stress, but it's having an effect on us. And so, that was, so in both of those senses, in the one sense, I realized I was burned out from thinking about the bond basis. I can't believe the bond basis is still a big deal out there, bond futures versus bond basis. That was one of the first things I worked on in 1984 when I came to Solomon and research, and we were still working on it, 20 years later. It was like, okay, enough. But yeah, this other part was more of a revelation to me, and I've heard it from a lot of other people.
Has that stress returned to your life now you're back in the dirty world of business?
No, definitely not. No, I chose a business that would be pretty stress-free. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned earlier the stress of constantly trying to beat the market. Speaking of beating the market, Jim Simons died over the weekend. Could you explain to the audience who he was?
Sure. Jim Simons, I think he's best known for being the founder of Renaissance Technologies. People call it RenTech. There was a great book written by Greg Zuckerman about his life recently I think it's called The Man Who Solved the Markets. I think that Jim is known for 3 or 4 things. One is this: he founded RenTech, which eventually has become perhaps the greatest investment return machine that anybody that has ever been. There's a few contenders that would vie with him, but they've gone on for like 25 years or 25 years or so. They've made 30% a year on their money, with almost never a losing year, very few losing months or whatever. And it's a team of a few hundred brilliant people that have kind of figured out how to suck money out of the markets consistently, it seems. So Jim was known for that, but he also had a very distinguished career as a mathematician. And when I was saying earlier that there's very few people in finance that really, or there are very few people at a very successful level in finance who have made big contributions to mathematics, Jim is an exception to that. He really had an amazing career in math. The third thing that he's known for is being a tremendous philanthropist. And the fourth thing that he's known for, is for being a pretty, like a very warm, kind person, helping a lot of people at the individual level as well. So yeah, he was, I guess, in his mid 80s, 84 maybe, I think he was, is that right, 84? Yeah,
86.
That's the age my dad passed away too, was 84, kind of a magic number.
86.
Sorry, 86. So yeah, he made it a few years more. So anyway, yeah, quite a legendary figure that will be missed.
You mentioned there were a few contenders that potentially have returned more money over time than Rentec. Who would they be?
Well, obviously, the first name that comes to mind that's more on people's mind than Jim Simons and Rentec is Warren Buffett. And so I think if we were like, okay, well, how much excess return in dollars has anybody made? I'm sure that that Buffett would stand taller than Jim Simons because he's got started so much earlier. So a very, very, very different approach. Where Warren Buffett is all about finding the intrinsic value and looking for great businesses at fair prices, and Jim Simons was looking for hidden patterns in short-term price movement. So totally at different ends of the spectrum there. But other very respected and great investors out there, or groups of people. You have the D.E. Shaw Group, David Shaw. There's Citadel that got a later start. Ken Griffin. I mean, they had a big hiccup, at one point in their track record that these others haven't. And then there's a bunch of ones that are not very well known and probably prefer to stay that way. A few friends here and there. And every once in a while, you hear about people that I've never heard of, and they're like, oh yeah, they've been doing this for 20 years, making 30% a year, and
Amazing.
now they're supporting climate change policies with their profits.
Could you go a little bit deeper into that? What would be some names of people we've never heard of? Not individuals necessarily, but maybe the organizations that they run.
Well, I think one that's I think people have heard about it more and more is PDT, process-driven trading. That's been founded by Pete Muller. I mean, he's really got a has a wonderful story of getting started in finance and really keeping interested and involved in music, and he's had these two pretty remarkable careers. One as
Cool.
a finance person, at Barra to begin with, and then Morgan Stanley, and then his own firm PDT, and also as a pretty accomplished musician as well, and just an all-around really nice guy. Princeton Newport is another one. Ed Thorpe, and his track record over the years is pretty amazing as well. There's other people in Southern California. There's Fred Taylor, who's run a pretty successful systematic trading shop. Two Sigmas, another one that had a really great run, a little bit less so recently. So there's a bunch.
Cool.
Out there.
And in your life, did you ever have any interactions with Jim Simons?
No, I never did. I've met some people that worked with him that were all very impressive, but no, not Jim. A few of my friends serve on this Math for America board, which was one of his big philanthropies. So have some friends who knew him well and really liked him a lot.
Mm-hmm. All right, Victor. Well, we're 30 minutes in. Haven't gotten to the first question yet, but it's going to be a dramatic tangent into Missing Billionaires. And so the book opens with an archetypal example of failed money management, which is the Vanderbilt fortune. At the time, was the largest in the world and was totally squandered in just a few generations because the inherited wealth took too many risks that exposed them to zero too many times. And this is just as asking you as a way to explain the ergodicity in economics, or at least the ergodicity in your thinking of long-term money management, why it's relevant to the Missing Billionaires thesis. I want to tell this anecdote of ergodicity from Luca Delana's book as a way to bring it up.
Okay.
So his cousin was an extremely good skier from a very young age, and he made it to the Junior World Championships. And he was, in fact, the fastest on the mountain. He was the best prospect Italian young skier. but he took really big risks. So he was always the fastest, but he ended up getting injured too many times and therefore didn't have the longevity in his skiing career. And therefore, the lesson here is that the best skiers in the world are not necessarily the fastest, but those who finish the race the most times. And so the longer you're in the game, the more refined your skiing gets and the less injured you are, the more time you spend on the mountain, the more competitions you can compete in. Therefore, in the case of competitive skiing, and at least from what I could understand from Missing Billionaires, is that performance is subordinate to survival.
So thanks for mentioning that book. I picked up a copy of it on Kindle over the weekend and enjoyed reading it. So first of all, in terms of that, story from Luca, it's a great example, and you can see that, figuring out, how many competitions you're going to win, given that you might have a stop out with an injury, is not trivial, but it's clear. But the intuition for why the expected number of wins is not just equal to the probability of winning times the number of times you race, because you might get stopped out with an injury early on. But one thing that's interesting, right, is if you had a really big population of skiers, right, then the best skier would be the one who had the highest probability of winning and happened to not get injured over that whole thing. So it just depends on how big your population is. If you have a big enough population, the best skier is going to be the one who has the highest probability of winning the races, and happens to be lucky enough to have survived all of those injuries. And the reason that I bring that up is that what we see in terms of the richest, maybe some of the wealthiest people in the world today are those who happen to not have had the career-stopping injury. And the one that really comes to mind is Elon Musk, where he is just taking an enormous amount of risk, an enormous amount of consequential risk, but somehow he's survived all of that, and has had skill and luck and everything all together, and so he winds up being one of the richest people in the world. And a number of those people that are in those top spots are people that have taken an awful lot of risk, and it's worked out for them. There are some of them, such as Bill Gates. Bill Gates would be the richest person in the world today if he hadn't diversified away from his Microsoft holdings, I believe. But it was sensible for him to do that, especially considering that the destination for his wealth was largely going to be philanthropic, and he had to think about the importance of stewarding that capital for his philanthropic goals. It belonged effectively to other people who really needed the money, and he couldn't just take huge risks with a small edge. Now, the counterexample to Elon Musk, I think, a counterexample in terms of outcome, but doing the same thing, is Sam Bankman-Fried, where he said, okay, I just want to maximize my expected wealth. He was many times questioned and quoted on that, and he's like, I just want to maximize my expected value. I'm not maximizing my risk-adjusted wealth. I'm trying to maximize my expected wealth. And, in general, when you're trying to maximize your expected wealth, it's going to end badly, because the road to maximizing your expected wealth is to maximize your expected return, not to maximize sort of the growth of your wealth or your risk-adjusted wealth, as in this ergodicity economics literature, they're talking about how risk eats, in these, call them non-ergodic processes, or just compound, to call them compound processes, right? In compound processes, risk eats return, and it eats return exponentially as you take more risk. So, like if you're, which is very simple to see, if you make 50% one year and you lose 50% the next year, you're not back where you started, you're 25% lower. And that's the basic insight of risk being a drag on compound returns, which is what's important to us. If you make 50% and lose 50%, you might say, my average return was 0. And that's right, your average annual return or arithmetic return is 0, but you lost 25% or 12% per annum you lost because of that excessive volatility.
The point being that remaining in the game is actually the sort of most important variable. The more times you expose yourself to the risk of 0, that will eventually catch up to you. There are maybe some few lucky exceptions, but the great majority.
Even remember that if you lose, if you lose 80% of your wealth, that you need to make 5 times your wealth to get back to the same place. So it's not just about 0; it's also about consequential losses to your wealth.
There's a great anecdote from you brought up Elon Musk from his life when he had all of his money. He obviously just is 100% all in, risk on, risk on, risk on, double down, double down, double down. When Tesla was in dire straits, SpaceX was in dire straits. And a quote from the Walter Isaacson book was basically, he can decide to give food to one of his children so the chance for it survives, or half to each for the chance that both of them die. He took the risk with both, obviously, and he came in money at the very last minute, and that managed to get Tesla, I think, maybe 6 months more cash. And anyway, the rest is history. Now he's one of the most influential people on the planet, let alone his wealth. But why is this lesson relevant to Missing Billionaires?
In our book, we talk about how remarkable it is that that there are so few or no billionaires today that can trace their wealth back to the early 1900s. And it's remarkable because it's been such a wonderful investment environment, and you would expect that some people would beat the market while others might not, and some people would have fewer offspring, and some people, there's just a lot of reasons why we should be seeing a bunch of them, but we see virtually none. And so as we were digging into that, it's like, well, what are the headwinds that investors face and that would have affected these families? And sure, you could be spending too much. There are taxes, there are fees, there are all these things. But taking all of those different things into account really doesn't explain their near total absence from today's ranks of the wealthy. And what we started to realize is that there's also this risk explanation where these families tended to have concentrated holdings in certain industries, in certain stocks. In the case of the Vanderbilts, it was railroads. And they just exposed themselves to a lot of extra idiosyncratic, non-recoverable types of risks, which over the period of 100 years or 120 years, those are going to come home to roost at different times. And especially if you combine taking quite a lot of risk in your investment portfolio with following a spending policy that has no risk in it. In other words, that you're kind of following like just a fixed spending policy where your spending doesn't go up or down with your wealth, but you're locked into like a fixed and growing spending policy, that creates like a leverage effect on the riskiness of your investment portfolio. And when you put those two things together, it tends to be pretty catastrophic. And so, I like this sort of toy example where you say, imagine that that you can invest in a portfolio which is going to give you a return of 5% above inflation and after taxes, but it's a concentrated portfolio in a handful of stocks. So the volatility of the portfolio is 30% a year. It goes up or down 30% a year. So so you say, okay, I have, $10 million or whatever, and I'm retired now, and I'm going to spend 4% of that. I'm going to spend $400,000 a year, let's say, because I should be able to support that over time, and I'm going to let that grow with inflation because my return is a 5% above inflation. And the question is, after 25 years, what's the most likely amount of wealth that person or family is going to have? And the answer is zero. That even though the expected return is 5% and you're spending just 4% of that starting wealth, that all that risk and all that fixedness to your spending drives the your median wealth down to zero. So there's over a 50% chance that you have zero wealth at the end of 25 years, meaning you've run out at 25 years or sooner, which is remarkable. And as the horizon gets longer, you get
counterintuitive as well.
Pardon?
Counterintuitive as well.
Yeah, I think it is kind of counterintuitive because we don't think, we think about that 5% return, but we don't think about what does that mean for a geometric return, right? But you can see it because so it's like 1 year you make 35% on your money, the next year you lose 25%. Well, that averages to 5% plus per year. But if you go up by 35 and down by 25, that actually brings you pretty close to where you started. But you spent 8% of your wealth, 4% a year for the 2 years.
So what's the solution to that problem then?
The solution is to be mindful of the risk that you're taking, to think about what's the right amount of risk to take given the expected return of your investment portfolio, and to tie your spending to that your spending and investing have to be tied together, that they can't be these separate things, that if you really can't take any variability in your spending, well, then you can't take any variability in your investing. If that's really the case, we think that for wealthy people, that's not the case, but they do need to realize that their spending does need to be variable as well to an extent. So just being really mindful about risk and what's the appropriate amount of risk to take given the attractiveness of your investment portfolio or your investment ideas is really critical. That it's not about maximizing expected return, it's about maximizing risk-adjusted return, or, in the more abstract statement of the problem, it's about maximizing your discounted expected lifetime utility. That's really the ultimate objective. But yeah.
Amazing. Is there a problem with thinking about expected returns? The difference between the expectations of you projecting into the future what I should get versus the hardcore reality that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, a lot of people will say, well, to make the right decisions, you're saying that I need to know the expected return of these investments and I need to know their riskiness, or I need to know the distribution of outcomes. And who knows what the distribution of outcomes really is? And of course we don't. There's uncertainty about our estimate of the distribution of outcomes. We don't know exactly what the expected return of the stock market is. There's some true expected return, there's some true distribution, but we can't observe that. So we have to estimate that. And then people say, well, but your estimation is just an estimate. It's not the truth. It's an estimate. And isn't that a problem? And it turns out that it is and it isn't. Mostly it isn't a problem, that uncertainty around our estimates is something that we can model and see what it does to those estimates, to the decisions that are optimal for us. And what we find in general in most cases, and we talk about it in the book somewhat, is that the uncertainty around our estimates for the kind of financial decisions that are most applicable to most people are not that consequential. And there's this great, to really illustrate this idea about uncertainty, sort of this uncertainty versus risk. There was this great experiment done by Daniel Ellsberg, a Columbia professor who also happened to be the guy at the center of these Vietnam documents. I don't know if you ever read about this.
I'm not familiar. No.
But he released a bunch of Pentagon papers about the Vietnam War and how poorly the policymakers and the government thought the war was going, but they were hiding it from the public. So he released classified documents to the press back in the 60s, and he was tried for treason and would have been executed, but he was acquitted. So he's like one of these, a relatively early case of letting the, that we have more recent cases of this, but he was back then. But then he also had this career as a Columbia professor. And anyway, he did this experiment trying to show how we think about risk versus uncertainty. And what the experiment was is this. He says, imagine that I'm going to let you play a game. I have an urn filled with 100 balls, and 50 of them are red, 50 of them are black. You reach in there. If you pick out a red ball, I'm going to give you $100. So that's choice A. Choice B is, here's 100 urns. I'm going to show you 100 urns, and the urns have a mixture, have an unknown mixture of balls from 1 red to not, or from 0 red to 100 black, or they could have 100 red and 0 black and anything in between. But I'll tell you that, on average across all of these 100 urns, there's a 50-50. There's
nice.
5,000 red balls and 5,000 black balls. But none of these urns are probably going to have, or just a few of these urns might have 50 red and 50 black. So you could choose an urn and then reach into the urn, pull out a ball, and if it's red, you get $100. So those are your two choices. Game A is you pick from this urn that's 50-50. Choice B is you pick an urn, and then you reach into the urn and pick it out. And what he found was, that most people preferred to pick from the urn that they knew was a 50-50 chance of being a red ball. Well, mathematically, we can show, or you can see when you think about it for a few minutes, that both games have a 50% chance of giving you a red ball. So sure, people might be averse to the ambiguity or the uncertainty of the distribution, right? Once you pick that urn, you don't know the distribution anymore, really. But it's the same thing. And of course, we can modify the game to get to the result that we want, where if we say, okay, now you pick one or the other, and you get to pick 10 balls out of it, right? Then the urn with that has 50-50 red and black is the less risky option, but you don't need to bring ambiguity into it. It's just like, okay, if I pick one of these other urns, now I'm going to be picking from an urn and I'm going to pick 10 balls from it, this repeated aspect. So, I think that we shouldn't cop out from, we need to have an estimate. If we're going to invest, we need to know the expected return and the risk of the things that we're thinking about investing in. There's no alternative to that. We can't say, I'm agnostic about the return of the stock market. I have no idea what the stock market's going to return, and yet I want to put 70% of my money into it. Like, that doesn't make any logical sense. You can't say that. Now, you could say, my estimate of the stock market's return is what it returned over the last 100 years. And I would say to that, that's a weird way to make that estimate. I think it's a very poor way to make that estimate, looking at the last 100 years to estimate the next 20 or 30 years. I don't think that makes sense with regard to the stock market, no more than it would make sense with regard to buying a bond. It's like I'm buying a bond today. Maybe it has a 5% yield. And I say, oh, what if bonds returned over the last 100 years? Oh, they returned 7%. So I buy this bond and I say, oh, if I hold it to maturity, my expectation is to make 7% because the last 100 years has been 7%. But no, I know that the yield of the bond is 5%. So I know if I hold it to maturity, I'll make 5%. But we do need these estimates of expected return and risk. Otherwise, we can't make rational decisions at all.
Amazing experiment. Could you just drive home? Because I'm not sure if I quite caught it, what the lesson is from that experiment.
I think the lesson from the experiment is that people behaviorally, that we don't like ambiguity, but that when you do the math, very often the ambiguity is not affecting the right choice to make. So ambiguity bothers us as humans, but when we think it through rationally, we can see that if the fact that we don't know that the stock market, we don't know the true expected return of the stock market. So you say to me, Vic, what do you think is the expected return of the global stock market? And I say, well, I think the global stock market has an expected long-term real return of 5%, above inflation. That's my expectation. And then you say, how certain are you of that? And I say, well, yeah, I don't know the true expected return. Maybe it's 6%, maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 6.5%. I don't know. I have a distribution around the expected return of the stock market. So then you say, well, then how can you make a decision about how much to invest in stocks? And I say, well, my estimate really is the most important thing, and I can also model that uncertainty around my estimate and all the risk of the stock market. Now, the risk of the stock market is much greater than the risk of my estimate of the expected return. But as long as my estimate is unbiased, I can more or less, it turns out that in many cases I can use that or use something close to that for the estimate. But it doesn't stop me. I can recognize that uncertainty and in my estimate and make a rational decision. It doesn't stop me short. If somebody says, oh, your estimate is 5%, but it could be 6%, and I'm like, yeah, it could be 6%, but my estimate is 5, and it could be 6, it could be 4, and I can figure out what that means for what's a rational amount to invest in the stock market if I know the risk as well of the stock market or have an estimate for that.
I love these social experiments which explain our behavior, which can then be extrapolated through to how we invest our money and take risks more generally. You write in the book that we carry around baggage from our evolutionary past, and then you make a lot of references to Kahneman and Tversky, among others. So what are some of the fun examples of this baggage that we're carrying around from our evolutionary past?
Gosh, I don't know how many of them are really fun. Some of them are funny.
Devastating, rather, is maybe a better way to put it.
But yeah, some of the fun. I think some of the fun ones are, these. I've always loved the one. It doesn't have much to do with investing, but I love the one, where you have the arrow, where the end of the arrow is either closed or open. And the length of the line looks different, as you're looking at it. And that's kind of just a fun optical illusion.
Right.
But I think that that our biggest...
Some that are specifically extrapolatable to investing.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think that the mother of all things that hurt us, I think, as investors, is our tendency to extrapolate, to make conclusions from a very small amount of data or information, and so, which leads to return chasing, which leads to just very unrealistic expectations of future returns and risk when we're thinking about different investments. And one survey that we did, or an experiment that we ran a while ago, is we asked a couple hundred people this question. We said, imagine there are two coins. One of them is a fair coin with a 50-50 chance of landing on heads, and the other one is a biased weighted coin that if you flip it, it has a 60% chance of landing on heads and 40% on tails. And so here are these two coins. Here you go, but you don't know which one is which, okay? So I'm going to let you flip both of them as many times as you would like, and of course, after a certain number of flips, you're going to conclude that the one that landed on heads more is the one that is the biased coin towards heads. And so the question that we asked these people is, we said, how many times do you need to flip these coins? What's the minimum number of times that you need to flip these coins that you want in order to be 95% confident that you're choosing the right coin, you're distinguishing correctly between the coins? Now, right to begin with, you have a 50% chance. If you just randomly said, I don't need to flip them, I think this is the weighted coin, you have a 50% chance of getting the right one because there's two coins and one of them is that. So how many times do you need to flip to get from 50% up to a 95% confidence? So we asked around 200 people. These are, sort of generally quantitative mathy people. And we said to them, please just tell us what you think. Don't code it up or don't try to calculate it. Just tell us what you think. And And a lot of people guessed, like 10 to 20 flips would be enough. I think the average number, the median number was around 15 that people guessed. The average number was higher because some people guessed a lot higher. So the average was around a 30 or so. But the answer is 141.
Wow.
And it's shocking. Like for me, I'm not saying that I would have guessed. I would not have guessed when I heard a version of this problem and we turned it into this one. I was also astounded at that intuition. It was counterintuitive to me. So it takes a really long time to, that even if you have something that's as stable as these two coins, let alone the track record of investors, that it takes a really, really long time to distinguish skill from luck, or to distinguish, a good investment from a mediocre investment, much, much longer. And actually that choosing of the 50-50 versus 60-40 is not that different from what you might find if you were trying to compare a passive, an investment in an index fund versus an investment with a stock-picking, active mutual fund manager. That, sort of that edge of, that if that mutual fund manager had the edge, that's about the amount of edge that you would expect per year, would be like a Sharpe of 0.2 or something like that, a 60-40 sort of edge in terms of outperforming the market every year. And people just extrapolate. We are hardwired to extrapolate from the short data sets that aren't even stable. The coins are stable. People's track records are not stable. The world is changing. They're changing. All of that. So, extrapolation, I think, is a big one. The second one I would mention, and, there's so many of them, but the second really big one, is just this overconfidence in our own abilities, right? Like we can recognize that we can recognize that on average, stock pickers can't beat the market as a mathematical identity, but it's like, but somehow we will,
Yeah.
that we can recognize it as it applies on average to the whole market, but we're exceptional, and we're going to beat the market. So I think those are the two sort of behavioral biases of the hundreds cataloged that really stand out to me as the two biggest.
Could you help me understand the practical application of that first example with a 50% and 60% coin for someone who is interested in managing their money? What is the practical lesson from that example?
I think the practical application is that when making your investment decisions, that you cannot rely on what has happened over the last 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years to make your decisions. That you can't extrapolate out that is far too little data in almost all cases to extrapolate into the future for how that investment is going to perform and what you should invest in. And so, investors who invest in things and then they say, well, how has it done over the last 2 years? I'm going to get rid of my losing managers and put more money with the people who have done well over the last 2 years. There's just no statistical significance. There's no statistical power, virtually no statistical power in the last 2 years of returns for people to make those kinds of decisions. And so you really have to be forward-looking in your assessment of investment alternatives and what's attractive and not. And this very concept is like emphasized. Whenever Warren Buffett talks about investing, he's always emphasizing, we cannot invest based on looking through the rear view mirror. That he doesn't go into the lack of statistical power of small samples, but it's the same thing. We cannot invest based on looking in the rear view mirror. We have to be looking forward and relying on our estimates of how the world works and how things will evolve in the future, and making estimates in that way.
Someone who thinks similarly along these lines, or at least also applies these social experiments to investing in his writing, is Nassim Taleb in his 5-part Inserto series. I just wonder whether he's informed your worldview at all.
I've enjoyed his books, and I've been to some of his lectures, and I've had dinner with him at least once that I can remember, and he's lovely in person. I think that his sort of he's so iconoclastic, or he just wants, he kind of wants to tear down he wants to tear down the conventional academic approach to choice theory and so on, that I think that, or at least historically, he's been more that way. And I think that there's a lot that we can draw upon from the last 50 years of advances in academic finance. And I think that I think that the idea of all of that is bunk, and we need to start over again, I think that I've enjoyed and learned and taken good lessons from his writing, but I think that he's a little bit too extreme in terms of saying that modern finance is all bunk and the creators of it should go to jail. I think that's I don't know. Maybe I think that's probably just for dramatic effect on his part.
Absolutely.
But still, I think that there's an awful lot that's really valuable in modern finance, and modern finance has always recognized that that we're building, that we're building models which are not the same as reality. That when we use certain kinds of distributions to explore different ideas, we're not saying that those distributions of outcomes are the real distributions. We know that financial assets have fat tails. We know that markets don't behave in a perfect sort of random walk diffusion, and academics have been writing about that from the very beginning. So I think that great contributions. But he hasn't. I think that he would say that that I'm part of the problem.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that put you on the spot or anything like that.
No,
it wasn't a loaded question.
No. But he's brilliant, and as I say, I've really enjoyed. I've enjoyed reading, listening to him, and even on the one occasion when we had dinner together, he was absolutely lovely and charming, and. He has a lot to teach us all.
Victor, just one more question to at least Missing Billionaires and Elm Wealth related, and then there's a few questions that I try to ask every guest who appears on the podcast.
Sure.
But to the audience, Missing Billionaires is available. I got it on audiobooks.com. It's also on Audible. It's on Kindle. It's everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, and I narrated the audio version as well. So.
Exactly. So if you like these dulcet tones, there's 11 hours more for you there. But this maybe is more of a loaded question, but I think a good way to finish off this topic. What are you doing at Elm Wealth, and as well the philosophy that's informed by Missing Billionaires, that's more sophisticated than if I just put my money in various indexes that tracked the top 100 companies around the world and kept it there for 50 years?
So, the idea of the book, what we're talking about in the book, is that in making our investment decisions and our spending decisions over our lifetimes, that we need to base them upon the expected return, the expected risk, maybe more broadly, the full expected distribution of outcomes for different investments that we that we have access to, and that we have to make our decisions that are maximizing our personal objective function, which we call a utility function, a happiness function, where that explicitly recognizes that the more wealth that we have or the more spending that we do, that the increasing benefit to us is declining, that there's a diminishing marginal happiness or utility from every extra dollar we spend or every extra dollar of wealth that we have. So that's the basis of the book, and the ideas in there. And at Elm Wealth, we try to apply those to managing our clients' investment portfolios. And so we believe that once a client sort of establishes their degree of risk aversion and what their utility curve might look like, and we can help them with that with some simple questions, that then when the expected return of the public markets is higher than in a baseline case, then we allocate more to those buckets of risk assets, more to U.S. equities and European equities and so on, and vice versa, less when the expected return relative to safe assets is lower. And we also do the same thing with regard to risk, because it's not just about expected return, it's also about risk. And so the riskier that markets are, the less that we allocate to them, and vice versa when they're less risky and there's less uncertainty. So, early in the pandemic, when the markets were going absolutely crazy and there was tremendous uncertainty about where the world was going, we reduced exposure to risky assets, even though they had already gone down. And then later that year, when things settled down and there was a lot less uncertainty about where we were going and what this pandemic looked like, we increased exposure again. And that helped. People felt a lot more comfortable knowing that somebody was doing that for them than if they just had kept a fixed percentage in the market through that whole time, because they might not have been able to keep a fixed percentage in the market. They might have panicked. They might have felt that this can't make sense to keep my 70%, and then they reduce down to 20% in equities. And then they pat themselves on the back because that was a good, we did the same thing. The market kept going down. And so they pat themselves on the back that was a good decision. And it was a good decision because the market was riskier. And so it made sense to reduce exposure. But then they might not have had a disciplined, preconceived approach to putting the money back into the market. So we know lots of people that got out of the market in early 2020 and haven't really gotten back in because it went up so much in late 2020, and they didn't have this disciplined approach to navigate getting back in. Sometimes getting out is the easier decision and the more clear one than getting back in as the market is going up. So we basically manage client portfolios in indexes dynamically. We call it dynamic index investing, and we actually even have a trademark for that because nobody else is doing that. And we think it's better than keeping a static allocation to equities over time. But having said that, we think that if you can keep a static allocation to equities that's kind of right for you, and sometimes the expected returns and riskiness of the market will tell you that you should have more and sometimes less, but you just say, no, I'm just going to keep to this because it's simple and this is what I want to do, that's still a really good thing to do. That's better than the third alternative, which is just to, willy-nilly do all kinds of things, as your sort of subjective assessment guides you. So I think a static asset allocation is still good, but we do a dynamic asset allocation. We also customize portfolios. So if a client wanted us to manage a more static portfolio for them, we could do that. Or, we manage, but most of what we do is manage these dynamically, which gives people a feeling that somebody is navigating the ship, that we're not just floating down this river, hopefully, and not hitting the sides or getting beached along the way or breaking our hull. It's nice to know that somebody is steering it. I think people like that. And so that's what we do at Elm. And it resonates with a lot of people, not everybody.
So it's exclusively indexes because they have lower risk, as we said before. But then you are and your team are actively going into and out of them according to the market, therefore hopefully offering a higher return had you just held it in that one index for a 20-year period. Right.
And, as Benjamin Franklin actually did say, a penny saved is 2 pennies earned, which talks about, which speaks to the fact that 2 pennies earned in a risky way is the same as 1 penny saved in a risk-free way. And so, we're very, very focused on costs. That's why we use these very low-cost index funds to get our exposures for our clients. And we also charge a really low fee. We charge 12 basis points for what we do, which is the lowest fee of any wealth advisor that we're aware of that's independent. I mean, Fidelity or Schwab charge zero, but then they put you only into their products. But for any independent wealth advisor, I think that our 12 basis points is about as low as anything that we've seen from others. And that's because we do things algorithmically. We use, and we're just dedicated to low cost. We think that's the low-hanging fruit that everybody should harvest is keeping your costs really low.
What do you make of, I don't know what this guy's reputation is amongst professionals like yourselves, but Michael Burry came out with this theory or this assumption, I'm not sure, but that because of the extreme amount of wealth in these indexes, they're actually subversively supporting inefficient businesses that would otherwise be more picked off by the market, because say if there's an index of 100 stocks and it's really only 5 or 6 of them that move the price of that index, then there's 95 guys kind of freeloading. That's his theory. I don't know if there's any sense to it, but just what do you make of it?
Well, there's so much criticism of index funds, of market cap weighted index funds. So there's Michael Burry, there's Michael Green, there's David Einhorn recently. There's, and the list goes on and on and on of people criticizing index funds for, I forget the firm. There was this one writer a few years ago said index funds are worse than Marxism and they're destroying capitalism. And I just
that's a bit dramatic.
First of all, not surprisingly, all of these critiques are coming from people who are active investors of one form or the other, and I think they're just completely wide of the mark in general. I think that index funds, if anything, are making the market more efficient, because the people that are investing in index funds would have been otherwise are the people that were the least informed, doing the weirdest things and padding the pockets of the smart active investors the most.
Right.
So when David Einhorn says, geez, these index funds are terrible because it makes it so much harder for us to make money at my hedge fund, it's like, what? What are you, how can that stand, how can he be interviewed and that stand somehow as a comment? Like, the market is less efficient because it's harder for us to make money. Wow. So anyway, the markets, there are so many people, the preponderance of capital out there is active money by far. And even if the market were 100% owned by index funds, active managers could still be making their bets on companies overvalued and undervalued through long, short hedge fund portfolios. So we're nowhere close to that. But I think that almost all of the criticisms of hedge fund, almost all of the criticisms of market cap weighted index funds are pretty wide of the mark. Save, one criticism that warrants consideration and solutions and so on is just that. To the extent that index fund managers are having a lot of governance control of companies, that we need to think about that. We need to do something about that. I don't like the idea of Larry Fink, getting to vote 15% of the stock of all companies out there, or 25%, if it grew or whatever. Like, there needs to be something figured out with regard to governance, because it just doesn't make sense for these index fund sponsors to have so much governance control over so many over all of the companies in the economy. There needs to be something done around that in some way. Corporate governance in general is kind of a bit of a mess. In general, it doesn't work very well even without those issues of concentration. But, I think these arguments of index funds are making the markets less efficient. Another argument that people have made is, index funds are always overinvested in overvalued companies. Well, hold on. If the idea of investing in an index fund is that you don't know which are the overvalued companies, then you can't say that index funds invest more heavily in the overvalued companies because you don't know which ones they are. There's a presumption there that you know which are the overvalued companies, that you believe that the overvalued companies are the ones with the highest market cap. You think those are the overvalued ones. Well, if you believe that, you shouldn't be in an index fund to begin with. You should be expressing that view through your stock picking. But to say that there's like this fundamental flaw in index funds because they are overweight, overvalued companies is kind of missing the whole logic that we don't know which are the overvalued companies to begin with. Otherwise you would be trying to take advantage of that. So you can't go to somebody who says, I don't know which are the overvalued companies, and say, well, you shouldn't invest in an index fund because it's going to be overweight the overvalued ones. And you're like, how can you say? You can't say that if you don't know. So that's an argument that is also out there. So I think, that I haven't heard an argument against, a really valid argument against index funds. I mean, there's another argument which I think is correct, which is that inclusions and exclusions of companies into and out of the indexes can hurt the returns of those index funds. But that is only, in my opinion, that's only in the case of index funds that are not broad enough. So if you have an index fund, which is the top 100 companies, sure, the 100th company is a huge company, and when that comes out or goes into the index, people are going to be gaming that. So the S&P 500 or the OEX, those indexes with 100 or 500 members, I don't like those. But we have indexes that have 4,000 stocks in them when the smallest companies are so small that them going in and out has no effect on returns. So, I think those things are solvable. Those are good problems that people have pointed out, and people have made a lot of money from the inclusion-exclusion game to the detriment of S&P 500 holders in general. But, those things are all things that we can deal with by constructing better indices, which have been done.
Well said, mates. Very interesting. We got two more for you, Victor. The first being, what is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
Everything, from being born in America to two loving parents, even though they didn't love each other, but they loved me and my sister. To being born in 1962, that was a really good vintage. But yeah, I mean the number of decisions that I've made that have really impacted my life have been so few, and so much has been sort of the luck and environment and serendipitous things that have come along. One in particular that just one of the greatest moments of serendipity in my life, actually, which wasn't to do with career or anything like that. My family I took my family on a hiking trip in this very desolate mountain lake area in the Wind Rivers in Wyoming. There's nobody goes there. It's a beautiful but remote place. And we were camping on a lake. And one day I decided with my youngest son, who was about maybe 5 years old, that we were going to go and hike along the shoreline of the lake. And we were hiking along, and at one point we had to go up a little bit. There were some kind of cliffs, and we had to go. It was steep, so we went up a little bit, and we were sort of shimmying across. And it was a little bit scary, and all of a sudden he lost his grip and his footing, this 5-year-old son of mine, and he starts to just slide and tumble down, like a 30, 40-foot cliff face that was then going to go another 20, 30 feet into the lake. And I'm just watching him, just absolutely terrified. And as he's getting to this crux point, I see that there's 3 hikers down there. We hadn't seen anybody for like the 4 days that we were up there. And one of them takes a few steps forward and stops him and catches Mark, my son. And to this day, I mean, our whole life would have been different potentially, if not for that. We went back. I was just absolutely shattered emotionally, through the whole thing. So yeah, I mean, yeah, just Yeah. I mean, we have to recognize so much of that stuff in our lives. And so little is what we really, we do our best, with how we manage our day to day, but ultimately there's that.
And that's an incredible story. Maybe one time out of 10 million on that exact moment in such a desolate area, someone's walking along.
Yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah, I mean, how do you make sense of that? Are you just a lucky person? Or like, how do you make sense of that? That's kind of wild. It's an extremely good story.
Yeah, no, I think I have been a very, very lucky person for sure. Absolutely.
Wow. One more moment of maybe forced serendipity projecting from my end, but you were the co-founder of LTCM, which at the time was maybe the most prestigious hedge fund in the world, at 31 years old. So was there serendipity in your trajectory to get there?
Absolutely there was. Yeah. I mean, winding up getting a job at Salomon Brothers from London. I was in London, and the head of this research group in New York, interviewed me and gave me a job all the way from London. I came over. He was a great mentor. Bob Koprash is his name. He wanted all the people that worked for him to get exposure and to, we were all working for him, but he raised all of us up. So then his trading desk, the government arbitrage desk, became aware of the research that I was doing in that group as a young person. They pulled me out. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing was kind of remarkable, how it all went along. And
Did you feel any imposter syndrome at the time when you were a 31-year-old co-founder alongside Nobel laureates, raising so much money, deploying so much money?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, it was, but so, I mean, I think, the majority of us felt that way. But yes, it was very common. The majority or many of us have talked about it over the years. One of my best friends who I started with at Salomon right at the same time, who's gone on to have a great career beyond Salomon and eventually in venture capital. We laugh about it all the time. I think he may have stopped feeling that way now. I mean, at some point, I think that imposter syndrome is replaced with an appreciation of luck, for many people. For me, instead of feeling like an imposter, I just feel incredibly lucky, that things kind of worked out luckily for me.
Nice.
So those are very related, but that imposter syndrome. Yeah, you hear about it a lot. It's a real thing. It's very common.
That's that sense of gratitude and optimism. It really shines through in everything that I've consumed of you, all the media. So it's a great trait.
Thank you.
Finally, Victor, last question. One I've asked hundreds of people now. I'm very interested to see, considering I think investors have as rounded a worldview, just in terms of how the world works, as really anyone else, bar a number of academics where it's explicit job, because you have to have a sense for how everything is interconnected as best you can. But that means you're consuming so much stuff, and etc. So for that reason, I think you're particularly well suited for this question. But what is a country that you're particularly bullish on?
Ooh,
and why?
Wow. I'm going to say it. I've got it. I've got my one. I am really bullish on the UK. And I think that the UK has so much to offer the world. It just can't get out of its way at the moment and for a period of time. So, it's a mess. It's an absolute mess, but it has, it has so much to offer the world, and it is fundamentally a tolerant place. It's a place where freedom and the democratic ideals and, individualism is so deeply rooted. And it's in such a bad place, right? So like I could be optimistic on other places, but they're doing really well right now. I think as soon as the UK decides that they want to really do well again, that there is just going to be on fire. I think it's one of the most desirable places to live, one of the most desirable places to bring up a family. London is this combination of New York, Washington, and Boston, right? It's the center of the government. It's the center of business, the center of finance, and it's the center of academic thought. All wrapped into one place. So yeah, it's having a really, really hard time right now, but it's going to be great. So yeah, you caught me on that one. Yeah, that was a good one.
It's funny you say when they want to do great. I mean, I'm sure they very much want to do great, and obviously Brexit was a great self-inflicted wound. But what are maybe beyond just your aspirations for the country? Do you have any indicators for what might give you the sense that the Great Britain that the United Kingdom has a very bullish future ahead of it?
Oh, that's also, yeah, you had me scared there with a really tough one. But no, I think I have my answer to that anyway, which is when it decides that it wants to be open to people coming in again, when it wants to bring in the best, when it wants to attract the best people in the world that want to go there, and to be open, to be this open society that's taking all kinds of people in from the rest of the world. When it gets over this misconception of immigration being a zero-sum game, it's not. It's a terrible misconception that immigration is that jobs and the economy is like somehow zero-sum. That an immigrant comes in and somebody immigrates and takes somebody else's job, and that's the end of the story. I mean, immigration, done the right way, is the greatest asset that a country can have. If you are a country that everybody wants to go to, that is a tremendous asset, and you need to recognize that and embrace that. And right now, the UK is not doing that. So as soon as that happens, we're gonna get there as well. I think another more minor one is rational taxation. I think that, if they rationalize taxation, like, this stamp, the 20% stamp, effectively a 20% stamp on expensive homes in London is ridiculous. I remember when France had that, and everybody was laughing at France for having it. Although in France, when they had that stamp tax, 30 years ago, everybody would get around it. And then, in the UK, they say we can't get around it, but then nobody's trading, which is, anyway, that's, just there's like some really dumb taxation things going on in the UK. But I just think this openness, I don't want to dilute my first one. My first one is really high. The second one is a much smaller one.
All right, Victor. Well, thank you so much for, one, being very generous with your time, and also, two, offering up some really, really interesting personal anecdotes, but then as well, things that you've researched for the book and for your work. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm really looking forward to meeting in person, hopefully in London in June.